Florida is cracking under pressure, and the warning signs are no longer subtle. In a state marketed as a paradise of sunshine, opportunity, and freedom, millions of residents are quietly being squeezed out of their own lives. Housing costs are exploding at a pace most families cannot survive, utility bills are spiraling out of control, and the basic act of living, renting a home, cooling it during record-breaking heat, keeping the lights on, is becoming a financial gamble. This is not a future scenario or an economist's projection. This is happening right now across Florida, and it's accelerating faster than officials are willing to admit. In cities like Miami, Orlando, and Fort Lauderdale, rent increases have become ruthless. Apartments that were affordable just a few years ago are now completely out of reach for teachers, nurses, service workers, and retirees. Families are being hit with double-digit rent hikes with little warning and no alternatives. Utility bills driven by rising fuel costs, infrastructure strain, and repeated rate increases are arriving higher every month, even as wages lag far behind. During extreme heat, Floridians are being forced to choose between comfort and survival, between running air conditioning or cutting back on food, medicine, and transportation. For many, there is no longer a safety margin, only constant anxiety. At the center of this storm is Governor Ron DeSantis, a figure whose national political profile has soared while life on the ground for ordinary Floridians has grown more unstable. While state leadership celebrates economic growth and population inflows, residents are feeling something very different: a cost of living crisis that has quietly turned Florida into one of the most expensive states in the country for everyday life. The disconnect is staggering. Official statements paint a picture of prosperity, but the lived reality tells a darker story, one of displacement, financial strain, and mounting fear. What makes this crisis especially dangerous is how unevenly it strikes. The people most affected are not the wealthy newcomers or investors buying up property. They are the workers who keep the state functioning. Healthcare staff commuting hours because they can't afford nearby housing. Teachers leaving school districts they love because rent consumes more than half their income. Small business employees quitting not because they want to, but because living close enough to work has become impossible. Entire communities are hollowing out, replaced by short-term rentals, speculative real estate, and empty units owned by people who don't live there. The consequences are already spreading. Hospitals face staffing shortages, schools struggle to retain educators, local businesses close earlier or shut down entirely because they cannot find workers who can afford to stay. Evictions are rising quietly but steadily. Homeless shelters are under strain. Middle-class families, once stable, are now living paycheck to paycheck, one emergency away from collapse. This is what happens when housing, utilities, and insurance costs surge faster than incomes year after year with no meaningful intervention. Yet the most unsettling part of this crisis is not how visible it has become, it's how normalized it's starting to feel. Rising rents are dismissed as market forces. Utility hikes are framed as unavoidable. Responsibility is blurred, delayed, or deflected. Meanwhile, Floridians are absorbing the shock personally, silently, and painfully. The pressure keeps building, and the system offers fewer exits with every passing month. Florida didn't wake up one morning in crisis. This was constructed over time through policy decisions, regulatory gaps, unchecked speculation, and ignored warnings. And now the state is standing at a dangerous edge, because when people can no longer afford shelter, energy, and basic stability, the damage doesn't stop at individual households. It spreads into public services, the workforce, the economy, and social trust itself. This is not just about high prices. This is about a breaking point. And Florida's closer to it than most people realize. Florida's cost of living crisis didn't explode overnight. It was built quietly, piece by piece behind closed doors, while warning signs stacked up and were repeatedly ignored. For years, housing experts, consumer advocates, and even internal state reports signaled that Florida was becoming dangerously exposed, too dependent on speculative real estate, too lenient on utility regulation, and too slow to protect residents from aggressive price escalation. Those warnings didn't stop growth. They didn't slow development, and they certainly didn't change policy direction. Instead, they were buried under headlines celebrating population booms and record-breaking tourism numbers. One of the biggest drivers was housing speculation on an industrial scale. As Florida marketed itself as a low-tax business-friendly haven, institutional investors and out-of-state buyers poured in. Single-family homes and apartment complexes were snapped up in bulk, often paid for in cash, driving prices far beyond what local incomes could support. Zoning laws remained rigid. Affordable housing development lagged. Rent controls were politically sidelined. The result was predictable: demand exploded, supply stayed tight, and prices shot upward with almost no friction. By the time the public realized what was happening, the market had already shifted permanently against them. At the same time, utility costs were quietly climbing. Florida's energy infrastructure, heavily reliant on fossil fuels and aging systems, became more expensive to maintain and operate. Utility companies pushed for repeated rate hikes, citing fuel volatility, storm recovery, and infrastructure upgrades. Oversight remained weak, consumer protections were limited. Each increase was approved in isolation, framed as temporary or necessary, but together they created a relentless upward pressure on household bills. In a state where extreme heat is not optional, electricity is not a luxury, it's survival. And survival was getting more expensive every month. Insurance compounded the problem. Property insurance premiums surged after repeated hurricanes and insurer exits, leaving homeowners and landlords scrambling for coverage. Those costs didn't disappear, they were passed straight down to renters. Higher premiums became higher rents. Higher rents triggered displacement. Displacement fed labor shortages. The chain reaction moved fast, and it moved without breaks. Yet even as premiums doubled or tripled for some households, structural reform remained stalled. Temporary fixes replaced long, buying time for headlines but not stability for residents. Leadership knew the risks. State-level discussions acknowledged affordability concerns. Reports highlighted workforce housing shortages. Economists warned that Florida's growth model was becoming fragile, but priorities remained elsewhere. Cultural battles dominated the spotlight. National ambitions consumed oxygen. Meanwhile, the mechanics of daily life, shelter, utilities, insurance, were left to the market. Even as that market became increasingly hostile to the very people holding the state together. What makes this failure especially severe is that it unfolded during years of economic expansion. This wasn't a recession-driven collapse. It happened while jobs were growing, tourism was booming, and tax revenues were strong. That should have been the moment to intervene, to stabilize housing, to rein in unchecked increases, to reinforce consumer protections. Instead, momentum was mistaken for resilience. Growth was treated as proof that the system worked, even as more Floridians quietly slipped beneath it. Now the consequences are unavoidable. The affordability buffer is gone. Families who once absorbed price increases can no longer do so. Workers are leaving. Essential services are straining. The illusion of limitless opportunity is colliding with the math of monthly bills. And the most disturbing realization is this: none of this was a surprise. The warnings were there. The trajectory was visible. The crisis was optional. Florida didn't just drift into this moment. It was guided here by choices, omissions, and a refusal to confront uncomfortable realities early enough. And now, with pressure mounting and patience wearing thin, the cost of delay is no longer theoretical. It's being paid every single day by people who did everything right and still can't afford to stay. The impact is no longer abstract. It's showing up in emptied apartments, packed moving trucks, and jobs left unfilled because workers simply can't afford to live anywhere near where they're needed. Teachers are commuting hours each way or leaving the state entirely. Nurses are picking up extra shifts just to cover rent increases that outpace their raises by double digits. Service workers, the backbone of Florida's tourism economy, are sleeping in cars, sharing overcrowded homes, or disappearing from the workforce altogether. When housing and utilities rise faster than wages, the first thing to break isn't the market. It's people. Entire neighborhoods are hollowing out. Longtime residents who built their lives around stable rents and predictable bills are being forced out, replaced not by new families, but by short-term rentals and speculative vacancies. Apartment complexes flip ownership, rents jump overnight, and lease renewals arrive with numbers that feel almost mocking. 600 more per month. 800. 1,000. For many households, there is no adjustment period, just an eviction notice or a rushed decision to leave the state they've called home for decades. Stability evaporates fast when shelter becomes a gamble. The economic ripple spreads outward. Small businesses struggle to keep employees, relocate farther away, or quit altogether. Restaurants reduce hours. Medical facilities face shortages. Construction projects slow because labor can't stay local. Cities begin spending more on emergency housing, social services, and crisis response, quietly diverting funds from development and infrastructure. What started as a housing problem turns into a productivity problem, then a public service problem, then a confidence problem. Once people stop believing a place is livable, investment follows them out the door. Utility chaos adds another layer of strain. Families already stretched thin are forced to choose between cooling their homes and covering groceries. Summer heat doesn't negotiate. Power bills spike during the very months incomes are most vulnerable. For seniors on fixed incomes, every increase is a threat. For parents with young children, it's a source of constant anxiety. The fear isn't just about money, it's about safety, about what happens if the power gets cut, about whether next month's bill will cross a line they can't recover from. Housing instability feeds into education. Children are pulled out of schools mid-year as families move suddenly. Attendance drops. Performance suffers. Teachers report classrooms in constant flux, students cycling in and out faster than support systems can keep up. These aren't isolated cases, they're patterns. When families can't anchor themselves, communities lose continuity. And when continuity breaks, the damage lasts far longer than any single budget cycle. What's most alarming is how quietly this damage accumulates. There are no sirens for displacement, no breaking news banner for a family leaving because rent went up again, no emergency declaration when a nurse packs up and heads north. The crisis unfolds in thousands of private decisions made under pressure, all pointing in the same direction. Less affordability, less stability. Less faith that staying is worth the struggle, and still the official response lags behind reality. Data arrives after damage is done. Task forces form after neighborhoods are gone. Relief measures trail years behind market shifts. The system reacts slowly to a problem that moves fast, and every delay compounds the cost. By the time action is debated, the fallout has already reshaped lives. This isn't just about numbers on a spreadsheet or charts on a news segment. It's about whether Florida can sustain the people who make it function. Whether growth without protection leads to prosperity or collapse. Whether leadership understands that affordability isn't a side issue, it's the foundation everything else rests on. Because once that foundation cracks, the fallout doesn't stay contained. It spreads through schools, hospitals, businesses, and entire communities, until the question is no longer how expensive Florida has become, but who it's still affordable for. The people responsible for the escalating disaster are no mystery. Governor Ron DeSantis, long celebrated for his aggressive economic policies and low-tax approach, now faces questions that can't be brushed aside. For years, state leadership has touted Florida's growth as a model for the nation, yet the very policies that fueled expansion directly contributed to skyrocketing housing costs and utility chaos. Incentives for developers, tax breaks for investors, and a hands-off approach to rent stabilization created a perfect storm that left ordinary Floridians exposed. When warnings came from economists, civic organizations, and even internal reports, they were largely ignored or dismissed as exaggeration. Every ignored memo, every delayed hearing, and every approval of unchecked utility rate hikes compounded the pressure on families who had no recourse. At the municipal level, mayors and city councils are caught in the same storm. Local officials often warned that infrastructure, zoning, and social services were falling behind the pace of development, yet their voices were drowned out by political grandstanding and partisan headlines. Policies meant to alleviate pressure, temporary subsidies, emergency housing programs, or oversight committees, were rolled out slowly, implemented poorly, or underfunded to the point of ineffectiveness. Documents leaked last year revealed internal memos stating plainly that certain utility rate increases would disproportionately affect lower-income households, but those increases went through without adjustments. The very people charged with protecting the most vulnerable were often sidelined by political priorities, leaving citizens to absorb the full cost of these decisions. Corporate stakeholders share the blame. Large real estate conglomerates, investment groups, and utility providers all capitalized on the regulatory gaps, amplifying the crisis for profit. Reports show companies lobbying aggressively to prevent rent control measures, secure tax exemptions, and approve rate hikes. While families struggled to make ends meet, boardrooms celebrated quarterly gains. The gap between policymaking and profiteering was never wider, and the consequences are now devastatingly visible. Empty apartments sit unaffordable, energy bills spike in the heat, and the human toll grows daily, a direct reflection of decisions made far from the households that feel the impact most. What makes this crisis particularly galling is the contrast between public statements and private acknowledgement. Officials repeatedly framed Florida as resilient and thriving, even as internal data showed thousands of households at risk, utilities on the brink of default, and local economies beginning to falter. Public messaging promised solutions, task forces, and long-term plans, while the reality was a patchwork of short-term fixes, delayed hearings, and bureaucratic inertia. Every press release emphasizing growth or opportunity clashed starkly with the unfolding suffering on the streets, a cognitive dissonance that has fueled anger, protests, and distrust among residents. The political theater also obscures a deeper truth: this crisis is not over. The longer systemic issues remain unaddressed, the more destructive the next wave will be. Housing speculation continues. Utility costs are projected to climb with summer heat and energy market volatility. Insurance premiums remain volatile after repeated hurricanes. Leadership may debate, lawmakers may argue, and press conferences may occur, but the real damage is cumulative, measured in families displaced, businesses shuttered, and communities fractured. The human consequences escalate faster than the political response, creating a sense that the people entrusted with solutions are operating in a parallel reality, one removed from the urgency experienced by everyday Floridians. Anger is mounting not because of a single misstep, but because the pattern is clear: warnings ignored, recommendations sidelined, and lives disrupted while leadership pursued optics over outcomes. It's not just a policy failure, it's a moral failure. The question is no longer whether those in charge will act responsibly, but whether they can act fast enough to prevent the situation from spiraling further. Florida's crisis is a mirror of priorities misaligned, a stark illustration of what happens when the mechanics of governance fail to protect those who rely on them most. Every delay, every ignored recommendation, and every calculated political maneuver compounds human suffering, leaving a state on edge, teetering on the line between managed chaos and full-scale disaster.